Okay, do we begin?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Hi, welcome to the Eastern Margins Roundtable as part of the Migration Matters Festival. Just before we get going, letting you all know that this panel is running under the Eastern Margins Safer Space policy. There'll be zero tolerance of any sort of discrimination. If anyone breaches this, they will be removed. But yeah, for those that don't know, Eastern Margins is a collective in London who work to platform East and Southeast Asian artists. I'm Jax, I'm part of Eastern Margins. I'm also a DJ, writer, and photographer. My background is actually in zoology, so I did pursue academic science at university, but then gave that up because I like nightlife. I'm Chinese Australian, I've lived in France and China, and I'm currently based in London. So with me today are our amazing panelists, and I will get them to introduce themselves. Zeke and Justin, do you want to go first?
Hey, my name is Justin. My artist name is Zekin. I'm a musician, fiction writer. I live in Sydney, Australia, so it's almost 1 a.m. here. So if I start to kind of phase into free-form prose, please excuse me.
All right, Katie, do you want to go next?
Yeah, hi, I'm Katie. I'm a freelance writer and editor. I write mostly about culture and social issues for US and UK publications. So places like ID, Huck, Sight and Sound, The Independent. And I'm also an editor for the Skinny magazine, which is based in Scotland. I'm usually based in Scotland, but I'm back home at my parents' at the moment, which is near Belfast.
Cool, okay, Nicole?
Yeah, hi, I'm Nicole. I'm an embroidery artist and designer based in London. I'm Hong Kong Chinese and Malaysian, but I grew up in Hong Kong and I've been here in London for 7 years now. My work is known to be quite messy, brash and disruptive, so I'm aiming to change the conversation of embroidery.
Okay, and Rachel? Rachel?
Hi, I don't know whether you can see me or not because I think my camera's off with technical issues. It's typical. But yeah, I'm a interdisciplinary performance artist based in London. I am a British-born Chinese. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, and my work, I work primarily in performance. My work is about science fictions and futurologies of the human body, and yeah.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so this panel is to talk about our experiences as East and Southeast Asian diaspora creatives. So I think the best way to start is, you know, how do we all get here as a creative? So I guess like my and like what obstacles that we had to face, and then this, so does anyone want to go first?
I can go first.
Okay, cool.
So I kind of started a little bit like EJEX, kind of doing something different and then kind of going into a more creative field. So I thought I was going to be an academic. So I was doing a master's in Edinburgh in modern literature and gender studies. And then I started doing some journalism for the university, kind of like an arts blog thing where it was meant to be, you were sort of mixing your discipline with sort of pop culture, like a lot of sort of cultural criticism. I started doing that and realized that that was a lot more fun than writing very dense papers. So I just kind of started doing more writing and slowly started building up a portfolio and kind of realized that academia maybe wasn't for me. And yeah, I just very slowly started writing for different places and built a portfolio and kind of started getting paid for work, which was very exciting, and realizing that this is actually a career. And then I became an editor and have sort of been doing this for, I guess, 4 years now, which is quite a long time actually. It feels shorter. It feels longer in different ways. So that's kind of how I got to where I am. I guess probably the biggest obstacle was not really knowing anyone who is a journalist or a writer. It's my family's background is very much sort of medicine and that kind of thing. So I didn't actually know how to do it. I didn't know like how you're meant to start doing this. I mean, the obvious route seems to be sort of like a journalism master's. I didn't really want to do that. That didn't feel like that was the right way for me. So kind of reaching out and using social media, especially to speak to people who are kind of my age who maybe don't fit into sort of a typical, the typical shape, I guess, of journalists in the UK at the moment who are wanting to write about things that are maybe a bit more on the fringes of culture. So yeah, that's how I got started.
Cool. Nicole?
Yeah, I've definitely faced like similar obstacles to what you were saying, Katie. But how I started was actually in just a different part of creative, which was fashion, media, and communication. So I was working mostly on like the production side of things, which was often producing and coordinating shoots for magazines and individual like freelancers who were photographers or stylists. But I felt like I wasn't creatively fulfilled when I was studying or when I was working in those sectors. So I always did like embroidery art on the side and eventually built up my portfolio. I didn't really have many connections in fashion or any sort of creative media, or anyone in the creative industry. So I kind of built my knowledge through a lot of it through social media and like just meeting up with people. And I got in touch with Galdem, which is kind of how I grew the confidence, how I kind of like became more confident in making this my own thing and pursuing it further. So yeah, it sparked from a different creative discipline and then onto this, which is embroidery art. So
Cool. And Justin?
I kind of came from, I also came from a journalism background. I studied journalism and government actually. So it's kind of heading into a very bureaucratic kind of position in my life. And I guess, you know, like a lot of people like learning music and creating music, I'd played the saxophone and I was playing in a lot of bands. And then I started to get gigs for the music I made, but the music I made was impossible to play kind of live. So I had to learn how to DJ. And then I started working at the Sydney Opera House and I still work there today. And I was working there as a publicist. So that kind of let me work with a lot of really great musicians and kind of world-class musicians. But on the complete other side of it, I kind of had to shelve that artist side of my personality and try and be a publicist, which is, you know, on one hand, very soul destroying because you have to pretend to like people's stuff a lot and, you know, kind of completely hide your own personality. But then, you know, and I've always had to kind of grapple those two parts of me. And then when kind of I co-founded Eternal Dragons about 5 years ago, we're kind of like a group of Pan-Asian artists living in the West. That was a moment where we could kind of say, where I could kind of respond to the music industry and the performance industry and say, well, actually, maybe there's a platform where we're not just catering to kind of white Australians, or we're not just kind of a platform created by white Australians. We can kind of make our own thing. And that's where I'm at now.
Cool. And Rachel?
Yeah, I'm sorry you can't see me. Yeah, so I've come from a fine art background. I did my BA, my undergrad at Loughborough University, which is East Midlands of the UK, and there wasn't so much of like an Asian community there. I think it was mainly sort of like white British, and I don't think it was, at the time, I don't think it was sort of a well-known as an art school. It was pretty much well-known as more of a sports college. And I was doing a lot of painting and drawing at the time during my early days of my practice, but I was also a performer and a dancer at the same time, but they were working in separate parallels at the time. And I think as I developed my practice, I began questioning things of my interests and things, and kind of emerging performance into fine art practice, and kind of researching more about performance art. It wasn't until I think a few years after graduating, I was in Manchester, and I was sort of still working out my practice, and it grew sort of away from painting and drawing and more into performance and the digital world. And then I got into Goldsmiths. I studied Masters in Fine Art at Goldsmiths. I graduated, I think, about a couple of years ago, or 3 years ago, and that's where I sort of really flourished my performance art, and developing the research in digital realms and technology, and informing the practices with the human body. And I chose Goldsmiths because I knew that program was going to be diverse of artists, and just sort of networking and finding these spaces for Asian diaspora. I'd never really sort of made work specifically about my identity, just because I wasn't questioned about my identity at the time. And I know that there are some artists that do make work about their identity, but as you bring performance or live performance into your work, you often need to question yourself or a human body in the space, in performative spaces, as it's quite loaded with history. So that's when I sort of thought about more about my identity and how it informs the work and my research. And so, yeah, I mean, at the same time, doing the practices, the struggles of contemporary artists now is to balance their practice and making a living at the same time. So we've been balancing part-time jobs with their practices, as all like creatives would do. So it's kind of going along with those struggles and trying to create during this really hard time, especially with the recession, and how you can push creativity a bit more during this time.
Yeah, I think as a creative, trying to like make your stuff and then also like make your work, find time for your work, and then also managing like a full-time job can be a bit tricky. Because I think like I haven't really spoken about how I got into what I do. So I actually faced quite a few obstacles, because I never thought I was ever going to be like a creative person at all. My parents were kind of just like, you can't do this. You either have to do science or be a lawyer. You need to make money, especially like immigrant working class family. They're just like, you know, within one generation, we need to go from where we are now to something much better. So I think there was a lot of pressure on me. And then I spent like a few years in Melbourne as a club promoter, working with a few people, and like I was doing, I guess, like a good job, but I had to deal with like a lot of racism, a lot of gatekeeping. It was a lot of just like, I never saw myself behind the DJ decks or anything like that. There was like that to deal with. And then I actually got to the point where I got so frustrated with it that I left Melbourne and moved overseas. And how I fell into Eastern Margins was I actually found them on Instagram, and I was like, wait, they actually make space for East and Southeast Asian artists here? Like, are you like, what? So that's when I DM'd them. It was just like, hey, I've got experience in music. Let me work with you guys. And they were like very welcoming. And then for me, that was like the first time I have ever experienced no gatekeeping in the industry. And that was like maybe 4 or 5 years after I started as a club promoter when I was like 19. I think because it was like such a supportive network, like community for me, that's when I like fell into DJing, and I started like, you know, because of that, I found a voice and I started writing more, started doing photography and stuff like that as well. But I guess what Rachel like touched on with identity is something that as all of us would have to go through with the work that we make. I know as like a DJ as well, it's just like the music that I play, because I never really saw my culture represented in like, I guess, the underground scenes that I frequent. I feel like as a, you know, I have to like push my identity more in the music that I play. As Justin, do you find that too with like the music and stuff that you DJ with? You like this kind of not like I feel like pressure is the wrong word for it, because I quite enjoy doing this, but I just know that like other creatives in the same scene wouldn't have the same pressure, if that makes sense.
Well, Andrew from Eternal Dragons, he told me the other week, you know, when we did another interview, that when he was in the music industry, he was kind of tired of working for white people who wanted to sell music. He got tired of marketing music that white people thought would sell. And I think I had a similar feeling where, as an artist, what does the label, or what do people expect of you? Like, what do they expect you to sound like? What do they expect you to look like? For me, it's a very conscious decision to not use certain sounds, like to not use like a gong sound, or to not use like Asian sounding things. My family is from Hong Kong as well, so a lot of the sounds that I draw on are not necessarily of kind of traditional Asian sounds. You know, what is that Asian identity? When I was growing up, a lot of it is video game racing soundtracks and R&B and trance. So those kind of things make up Asian identity to me, and those are the things that I kind of want to represent. You know, when you're an Asian artist, you always have to question yourself and ask, what kind of Asian are you presenting, and what kind of Asian do you want to present, and to whose gaze?
Yeah, definitely. I think I find that too as well with my writing, as like some of the topics that I do talk about, it's very just like I know if I pitch to certain publications of like, hey, I can talk about racism, it's like, do I actually really want to talk about this? Because it is like a hard topic to discuss or write about. But then I know that doing that, I'm more likely to get a job out of it, if that makes sense. And I think it's just like, I think for us, it's just hard to like find the balance between like identity and I guess like tokenization. As you like, you know, as Justin said, like what type of Asian, it's like sometimes I'm in that mindset where it's just like, what type of Asian are they looking for? And should I adjust my work to suit that? Katie, do you find that with writing at all, or?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that I noticed when I started doing a lot of opinion writing and opinion pieces. A lot of publications would ask me to write about my identity in different ways. It's funny actually, because I really became an expert on anything to do with Asian culture, anything to do with queer culture, anything to do with Ireland, anything to do with Northern Ireland, anything to do with Scotland, just because I have some sort of relationship to all of those identities, which is quite funny because it's like these publications are all normally based in London, and it's like if they can't find anyone who's not white, straight, based in London, they will look for people, and then that just becomes your beat, is to talk about these issues. So I've made a really conscious decision not to pigeonhole myself in that much. It's like, and where am I sort of sharing my experiences and my voice and my work and my labor, and making a conscious decision to work with editors who are people of color, who have an understanding of where I'm coming from, and who aren't just looking for me to sort of write about trauma and just sort of use that to get clicks and to get to make money from it. So I think, Nicole, you mentioned Galdem. I mean, they're maybe one of the only places I'll write about issues to do with race now, because I understand that who's behind the scenes in their ethos and what they are wanting to put out there, and why as well. It's not just to sort of rehash trauma, but also to feel like you're connecting with people, and a sense of sort of communicating, and there be an acknowledgement, and you're not sort of explaining things for a white reader, which is what a lot of publications, I think, want you to do. So yeah, I mean, I've made a really conscious decision not to write as much about identity, because it's just exhausting. It's like you can't just go through and just talk about your trauma.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's the same with me. I guess because I was always asked to write quite a lot of things, and a lot of it was unpaid as well, and a lot of it was these publications being like, oh, we want to look diverse, can you please write something for us? And it's like, well, no. But with Galdem, they were like the first, I guess, like platform where I was comfortable pitching stories to them about like what I had to grow up with, because I knew that the people, but the editors and stuff like that, they wanted to hear it from a perspective of like me sharing my story for like a wider understanding, and not so much from like, I guess, the tokenization perspective. Nicole, with your artwork, do you have like that issue with identity or like tokenization?
So yeah, I'm constantly thinking about like whether I'm just like the token Asian, or whether I'm being commissioned because like it's like a diversity thing. And I think a lot of people as artists, as creatives, like face that, especially, I don't know, especially when you're a person of color. Identity and my artwork is tied together because my art is fueled from my experiences, and that's something that no one can take away from me. So I think it is important for me to constantly show that, and not just, I don't know, not just create things to fit into a certain mold or what people think like Asian artists, for instance, should be like. I think it's important for me to speak about my own experiences because, yeah, it's like individual to me, and because my work is so based on like mood and emotion, a lot of people from outside of like from everywhere, regardless of like their identity, can connect to that. So I think that alone is quite powerful. But yeah, I don't know what else I could really say. I'm kind of stuck because like what Justin and Katie was saying was exactly like what I was thinking. So I'm not really sure what I could add, but.
Can I ask, like when you're working with, because you're a visual artist, it's so easy to just kind of take visual Asian imagery. Like, what do you do when you take that or approach that?
Sorry, what was the question?
What happens when you take Asian imagery, or when you work with Asian, like very explicit Asian imagery, like a dragon or jade or like Chinese characters or something? How do you do that?
So for me, a lot of the things that I present in my work visually have always been about like presenting strong women and like showing. I've done a series on like Asian women and showing them in like a really like strong and powerful way, because I think for me growing up, I always wanted to see that imagery. I'm one of 4 sisters, so I always felt like looking at really empowered and really confident women was really inspiring for me. So I guess that's like one of the ways that I approach that. In terms of like the dragon and other symbolisms, I think I don't really like use them a lot in my own work, but it's just because it's not really symbols that I felt connected to for the time that I created the pieces that I've made. So it's not necessarily like I'm against using that or I'm for it, it's just it wasn't right for the time. But I feel like regardless of like what you choose to create, if you're expressing it from an honest point of view and if you're creating from like your experience, that's really important to kind of spread, because that's your experience and yeah, no one can take that away from you. So I embrace it if it comes my way and if I want to use it. But if I'm using it, it's because it is from my point of view and like it's from my experience, and not just taking elements of culture without really, I guess, using it with any sort of like intention or value to my message. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I actually have to agree with you. Yeah, because I think like even for me, the dragon symbol, even with like clothing that I wear as well, sometimes I feel like a bit of a caricature of myself, just because like it's been so appropriated by so many other people that when I do reclaim it, I feel like I just have those feelings in the back of my mind. But yeah, as Nicole said, if your intentions are there, then why not? Rachel, have you got anything to add? Oh, Rachel's microphone is off. Okay. But yeah, anyways, so I think like the discussion with like identity and tokenization, it really, I it does lead into, I guess, the next point that I really want to talk about is like the space that we do make for ourselves, and also how that relates to the space that we take up in our respective industries. I think for me, like this, like the space that I take, like Eastern margins, you know, sometimes we do talk about how do we prevent ourselves from pigeonholing ourselves. And then also in respective to like the music scene, like we need to look at the bigger perspective of where we take up in music, especially given what's currently happening in the world too, with like a lot of anti-Blackness racism going on as people in the electronic music industry, like that is from Black culture. So it's just something that we need to be mindful of. Justin, do you have like those type of thoughts as well when you make music or when you take up, I guess, like space, even though like the space that we are deserving of this space, it's like the outside space, if that makes sense?
Yeah, we try so hard as artists to fight for space and for sanctuary and for safety, but I think we really need to question what we're fighting for. You know, as East Asians, at least I have used the tools of kind of the oppressor to get where I am. You know, like there are ways that you kind of operate in the industry, and there are things that if you have learned from kind of the white industry that has been formed around us. And I think what we need to do is kind of break all that down and like decide, well, maybe like this is not the best way to structure an industry. Maybe record labels aren't the best way to structure an industry, or the way we invoice is not the right way to pay artists, you know. So I think we as Asians, or me as a kind of Hong Kong Australian, I need to know that when I'm in a position where I can represent people, what am I going to do with those resources? Am I going to push them around, or am I just going to continue to try and kneel on people to kind of climb up? Black lives are more important than ever. And in Australia, especially, the conversation is around Indigenous lives, because it's kind of a parallel thing we have here. But of course, both matter. We need to recognize that our culture benefits from that and sounds like it. And we need to recognize that we are not like Asians are not the most underrepresented kind of people on the planet, you know, especially East Asians. You know, we as kind of very kind of light-skinned East Asians take up space. And we still, and with Eternal Dragons, we need to be representing queer, non-binary people of color. We need to be representing Southeast Asians, and we do that. And we need to recognize that we can't become the oppressors ourselves.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great point there, because it's just like, I think, like, I mean, Asian privilege is something that we do all benefit from, even though we do go through like oppression too. And it's like our proximity to whiteness as well does help us in many ways, especially like the whole like model minority trope that goes around too. And I feel like it's also up to us to use our privilege when we can. Katie, do you find is there like ways, I guess, that you can make space in the writing industries? Because I know with me, I did get a publication reach out to me to ask if I could speak about racism with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I literally just said to them, like, why can't you just pay a Black person to do this instead of myself? Like, it's just inappropriate for you to ask me, even though I am a person of color, it's not my voice that needs to be amplified here.
Yeah, definitely. I think what Justin was saying about not becoming the oppressor is really important, especially what I was touching on earlier about opinion writing. I mean, I've become a commissioning editor myself who asks a lot of people to write about their opinions, and it's like, how did I do that without becoming exactly the people that I was talking about earlier, making people sort of rehash their trauma, and how do I create a space that feels safe for people to talk about what they want, but never to feel pressured to talk about a certain issue. And that's something I've been thinking about a lot, and I've been thinking about a lot, kind of watching how publications are sort of scrambling to find people at the moment to write about racism and Black Lives Matter. And yeah, it's like what Justin's saying, it's about sort of creating space and acknowledging that not only do I have Asian privilege, I also have white privilege as a mixed race person, and it's about sort of, yeah, it's helping people up, but also knowing when you need to sort of step back as well, and sort of need to let them decide what to do with that space, rather than sort of you helping someone up and saying you have to do what I was doing, or you have to follow this path, and realizing that journalism and writing is becoming very different at the moment, with more people sort of taking power into their own hands. So, I mean, we've seen a lot of, in terms of criticism, a lot of criticism coming from people like the White Cube, who are not writing for established publications like traditional ones, but instead are creating their own spaces. And I think that's really, it's so exciting to see that people are creating these spaces and they don't need to go sort of the old traditional method of waiting to be asked to write about something. They're doing it themselves and they're creating space themselves. So I think that's something that I've been thinking about more and more, especially at the moment, and about wanting to do more of that actually, and wanting to sort of help more people do that. And I think also what Justin was saying about the entire structure needs to change. And I think journalism is one of those industries that it hasn't changed in the last, like, I don't know, since it began. It's not changing. Even with the digital age, everyone thought that journalism would change, and it really hasn't. It's just sort of stayed pretty much exactly the same, and the gatekeepers are the same. And yeah, I mean, people are just now, they're sort of sprinkling diversity on top of their publications, and they're, you know, making diversity funds. And this is like a bigger issue as well. With, I read a lot about film, and film festivals have started realizing that all of their critics who are attending their festivals are usually white, and they're usually middle-aged men as well. And they've started these diversity funds to try to get more people to their festivals, but it's like, that's not enough. It's like the publications themselves, they need to really look at themselves and completely dismantle their structures, and they're not going to do that without pressure. So I feel like the more people who are speaking out about pay gaps and not being treated well, which we've seen in the last sort of few weeks with different writers, especially Black writers, who are speaking out and sort of yeah, taking them to task on it.
Yeah, that's like it's like happening in the music scene as well. We've got like so many major festivals that are just like, oh no, we care about diversity, we do. And then you see the lineup that they like released like yesterday, and it's just all white people in the lineup. Actually recently, I think and just another thing as well, just being, I guess, like Asian in like a space like that is like, and what Katie said about like speaking up, it is important for us to speak up and say something about these things, even though it might not actually like, I guess, like personally affect us. Because yeah, I did see a festival come up, and the person that booked that festival, they were going on about Black Lives Matter and how they really cared, and then that like the majority of that festival lineup was still white. And then that's, you know, that's when it's just like, okay, like I should say something about this. And having said that, it did help. They actually like stopped the festival, which is like probably a good thing.
Good, yeah.
But
even more poisonous is that like major arts institutions who have this who have this like diverse program booked by 10 white people. Like it's their image of what diversity looks like. It's not they like Katie said, they're unwilling to kind of give up that power because they've been in there for centuries.
And
that's even more like scary to me.
Yeah, no, definitely. Nicole or Rachel, do you have that experience, I guess, with more visual art and performance art industries? Because I do know, like, I'm not that fully into art myself, but I always hear about how like museums and all that kind of stuff, it's like loads of gatekeeping there. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I've definitely had experience with that, where I've discovered that like grants or things that I've applied for, which are meant to be about embracing, like, say, for instance, your Chinese heritage, have all been white people on the board. And it kind of scares me how common that had been for a while. I think the decision makers really need to take and acknowledge like their privilege and think about how they use it to truly be diverse. Like, yeah, it's just odd that what Justin was saying, that's been the case for so long, and the unwillingness to give up that power has actually set us back quite a bit. So that's just what I think.
Yeah, and I think with that like sense of power as well, I feel like a lot of us within the Asian community, we feel like if we get that power ourselves, it is like diversity, but like we've discussed, it's like we then become the oppressor, so we need to do more to break that down. Yeah. Rachel, have you got any opinions on the matter?
Yeah, I've got my camera fixed, which is great.
Welcome back.
I'm back. Yeah, I think like this is something within the arts, like, because it's so precarious and so vulnerable, because it's so like marginalized, and we have like marginalized artists or people of color in the arts. Like as Nicole said, like when it comes to grants or art organizations that are pretty much run by white people, and they sort of tick all the boxes for diversity and equal opportunities, but actually, you know, when you look at the staff and the people, the advisors, the board committees, they're all white, and that problem is trying to, you know, racial diversify the staff of people in these organizations, and giving them the opportunity to contribute to educational programs, and giving them opportunities to rise to leadership positions, so that there would be more of a diversity on these boards. So yeah, that's what I'm tackling especially when I'm job hunting, as like, you know, as an artist that needs to survive on the side. They don't, I mean, as much as they say that they tick all these boxes to have equal opportunities for everybody, but I just don't see it happening at all. And that's why we're, especially in this movement now for Black Lives Matter, people are putting pressure on these organizations, these galleries, these museums a bit more. I don't know if you've been seeing the White Cube. One of their things on their website, they've created these letter templates for artists to lobby at their institutions or galleries, to put pressure on them and speak and list some actions of what they're going to do in response to these protests, because the time is now, basically.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just the thing, it's just all these boards with like white people and stuff on them. And I think that just relates to this actual festival of Migration Matters. It's like we do live in like quite, especially the West, it's quite diverse in its multiculturalism. And it's just not seen in positions of power, which is just because, yeah, these systems are gatekeeping. And like, I think from our experiences as creators as well, we've all met some sort of gatekeeping too. So I think just having a look at the time and the stuff that are discussion points. Does anyone else have anything that they'd like to add in particular? I guess.
Yeah. I just think we should collaborate more with Black artists and people of color. I've always made it a thing to do that throughout, especially like ever since being at Galdem. Just, I think it's really important to show love in that way, but also like think about where you source your materials. Definitely. Like buy from Black businesses and support each other rather than fight against.
And yeah, and you saying that actually reminded me of a point that I thought of like a few days ago. It's just like so many Asian artists and Asian creatives I know, to try and like, I guess, make it in the industry, they're more than willing to work for white people for free. But when it comes to like working for Black platforms, it's a no. And that within itself is just anti-Black racism. And I think that kind of trickles down to our community as well. And I think another point that I wanted to touch on as like creatives with the platform is like what more that we can do to combat anti-Blackness within our communities. I think, Justin, I saw a post that you posted on Instagram about like going to protests and saying like Asians for Black Lives. Do you want to go into that a bit more?
Oh yeah, I'm really interested to hear what people think about that. It's been a conversation in Australia a lot that, you know, when we're going to protests, trying to kind of decenter Asianness as part of the discussion, I guess, because one, it's confusing enough here already, because we have Black lives and we have Indigenous lives, and they both face such injustices, and we need to stand for both. But how do we do that without making ourselves the center of it? Are we going to hold up signs that say kind of yellow peril for Black power or Black lives? Or does that actually detract from who we're trying to stand for? Who is that sign for? You know, are we using that sign to signal to other Asians? Because part of me thinks it is. It's kind of to say, hey, or to signal to white people to say, we're Asian and we stand too. But, you know, our presence is enough and our face is enough when it comes to protest for Black lives. That's what I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think like when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement, it's definitely, we need to be amplifying Black voices. Because me and an artist based in New York, we actually worked on a Yellow Peril Supports Black Power artwork, which we decided in February to do it, but that was more based on, I guess, like our experiences with coronavirus and how we were asking for solidarity from the Black community, to which I was like, as an Asian community with so much anti-Blackness racism going on, we shouldn't be asking for solidarity if we don't show that in return. And then so when I saw that and I saw those posters coming out for the Black Lives Matter movement and then the criticisms for it, it did make me understand it's like, it isn't always about us. And like, does anyone else have any points or like opinions to add on that point?
I personally agree with everything you said, but I think the other thing that I've seen is like, not to forget that it doesn't mean we have to hate the things that we've achieved as well, if that makes any sense. Just because I don't believe, while I do support Black Lives Matter, and yeah, it's not about us, you're 100% correct. I do see a side where people have easily fallen for, I guess, putting down our achievements to uplift others when we should, you know, uplift them at the same time. I think, yeah, time and place, I guess, but that's just something that I've seen so far that I just wanted to say.
Yeah, I think like time and place is important, and like what, because yeah, obviously with the Black Lives Matter movement, it wasn't like a bounce off coronavirus racism or anything like that. It wasn't like a global discussion on racism. So that's where I guess there is a difference. But I think it's just like, as artists and creators, we all have our platforms. What more can we do?
Collaborate more.
That's right, collaborate more.
Yeah, just show love, honestly. Just be welcoming, be open. If you have a platform, use it, obviously. Really simple, but acknowledge your references. Because a lot of the time, I feel like that's when like cultural appropriation becomes a thing, like when you don't acknowledge where you've gotten what you've gotten from.
Definitely.
And yeah, just make that, voice that out.
What about, I guess, Alex, from a perspective of us as migrants? Because I know now, like, even though, because yeah, I'm Chinese Australian, my parents migrated to Australia like 30 years ago. I know that their English isn't great at all. They didn't grow up in, I guess, the Western climate where we see the differences of racism and stuff like that. So I guess, translating anti-Blackness documents into Chinese to try and explain to them what it means and why they have to care about it. Because like, I guess from like my parents' perspective, they're just like, oh, I escaped communist China. I've been through like some terrible stuff. What, it was hard for me in Australia. Why do I need to care about this? And I think that's kind of important for us as like migrants to do that, to take some responsibility to connect, I guess, with our like homeland, even if like maybe our roots aren't as deep. I feel there definitely is some responsibility. Does anyone like to add to that?
Yeah, I think educating families is like a huge one, because like we're the younger generation that's like moved here, or I've been born here. My parents are immigrants from Hong Kong, and they were educated here in the UK. But it's not necessarily that I mean, they've suffered a lot of racism too, but I think we, as younger generation people, we're more aware of and supporting Black Lives Matter, but I feel like there's more of a struggle with first and second generation immigrants that are still sort of not so aware and not really trying to understand where we are much more privileged, and I don't know whether they are sort of supporting Black Lives Matter a bit more. I don't know if there's a little bit of racism towards each other there as well, and it's just really difficult to have these conversations, especially in an Asian household, because there's a lot of hierarchy and a lot of tension when you're trying to make your family understand. But yeah, I think those conversations need to be had, and that's part of activism that we can try to improve. Generally in arts, they're quite, from my knowledge, they're quite self-aware, and as Nicole said, collaboration is a good thing. But yeah, I think talking to families and those voices, and the younger generation as well, like the even younger ones.
I think it is quite important to educate who we can on this, just because like from what I know, the school system is actually quite bad at educating all of us on racism to begin with. I think for me, even managing my own like experience with racism, I had to learn a lot of that on my own, because that just obviously like wasn't taught in like the white school system. Katie, have you got anything to add at all?
Just what everyone else said. Yeah, communicate, talk, share. I think that that's the great thing about social media, and that we can use that as a tool to share. I mean, yeah, I wouldn't know half the stuff I know about social media without hearing directly from Black activists and writers. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of social media gets, you know, there's a lot of backlash against it for performative activism, which is 100%, you know, accurate a lot of the time. But at the same time, it is a really useful tool for sharing, and it's that I think does more than maybe sometimes what we give it credit for, in terms of, especially with young people, sharing information. So yeah, exactly what everyone else said, just talking, and yeah, not centering ourselves in this movement, but sort of at the same time ensuring that we're talking with our communities and our families as well.
Definitely, because yeah, I think like from, I guess what I spoke with Eastern Margins, it's like we create our space for us, but we also need to keep space as much as we can, because we are able to do that. I mean, you know, gatekeepers keep a lot of space from us. We can also make space for other people too. So we've got some, so I think like now we should open up for some questions from the viewers. Everyone can see the Q&A option, can't they? Okay, let's just, what do panelists think about prejudice and misunderstanding of different communities? Does anyone want to take the lead with that question at all? So I should read it out. So the question is, what do the panelists think about prejudices and misunderstandings between different communities within East and Southeast Asian diaspora? For example, the lived experience of overseas Chinese is very different from the experience of overseas Cambodian, but we sometimes lump it together. Would anyone like to take the lead at all? Well, yeah, so I think like personally, as someone who is Chinese Australian, I do understand the privilege that I have, even I guess from listening to my own perspectives from my parents and how they talk about other people, which is probably why I don't get along with my family. But yeah, I think it's just like, it's just like the experience is quite different, and it's just something that we need to acknowledge, because it is, I think a lot of it also comes from, I guess, our like identity from the Western gaze. We constantly do get lumped into the one identity of being Asian. I mean, Asia includes like South Asia as well. There's 48 countries in Asia, I think, from like you know, the map. So we always get constantly lumped in. I think as like within the different types of like within the different Asian demographics, there is privilege we can acknowledge, but also like history and stuff as well, and just understanding the relationships between each Asian country and the history of like what's happened. Does anyone else have anything to add at all?
Yeah, I think it's really important to show that Asianness is not just one thing, whether that's through your own creative practice, whether that's the way you like converse in day-to-day life, just like you said, there are like 48 countries in Asia, and I I do think it's important to, that's why I said collaboration is really important, and also just showing love for other, I guess, forms of work from different Asian people's perspectives, because it will then, by representing you're kind of educating through that, through putting it out there, even existing in certain spaces. So I just want to see more.
Definitely.
Hopefully more people in decision-making positions will be able to use their privilege to like enable that, and that'll just make the world more educated about, I guess, Asia in general.
Yeah.
And there's such a rich history as well with
Yeah.
the interactions between different countries and our histories and things, and the fact that there is this sort of gaze that casts everyone as the same. It just completely erodes our history, which is, I mean, it's racist, but it's also a shame because that history is so exciting. I mean, recently I've been definitely reading a lot more about the relationships between different Asian countries. I'm Chinese Malaysian, and I've been reading a lot about the history of Malaysia with China and also Japan, and it's just been fascinating. And so I think that the more that we educate ourselves as well, is, I mean, the better everyone is.
Sorry, you go, Justin.
Oh, I'll be quick. Yeah, when I studied government at uni, I studied Southeast Asian politics, and I was so horrified by the way kind of actually Chinese people behave against Southeast Asia. Yeah, I think, like I said, we work so hard to carve these spaces out, but let's not. There are still levels of whiteness within Asia, and let's not be kind of the white people of Asia. You know, let's make sure we're still opening those spaces up to everyone in Asia, and especially to people in Southeast Asia.
Okay, we've got some more questions. What advice would you give to young Asians trying to enter a creative field? My sarcastic answer is have a day job. Because it is hard, especially because, like, given the current circumstances of the world with like the recession and stuff like that as well. Does anyone else have any advice that they'd like to give?
I would say, yeah, have a day job. That's really fun. Honestly, just do it. I know I grew up in Hong Kong, and my parents were supportive, but it was more like society was really against, or like made it seem like it would be really tough to make it a career. But just want to say it's not impossible, and if you'll eventually find a way to make it work. So start.
Yeah, definitely. If there's a will, there's a way. I remember saying to myself, I want to be a DJ, and it did eventually happen. It takes time. Everyone has certain different obstacles. A lot of people do have it easier. Don't let that, like, you know, hold you back or anything. Like, I was always getting disheartened by, I'm like, why does that person have all these sets and I don't? Turns out they're a white guy. That's why they have all of them and I don't. But but yeah, I just like kept going. Does anyone else have any advice?
I think just keep doing what you do, what interests you to be, whether it's an artist or in the contemporary art field. Just, you know, don't feel uncomfortable or let anyone question why you are making work because you're an Asian that's making work in the UK. You know, like, you shouldn't have to justify that. It's like, you know, you're creating because you want to be creative. You want to do something that you want to be making work about, whether it's sort of like photography or painting, like whatever subject matter, like, and also just be aware of self as a person, but you don't have to justify why you're making this work. So.
Okay. Oh, this is a good question. What are your thoughts on moving away from the term Asian, as Asia is so diverse and each culture differs greatly? Was anyone like to start with answering this at all? Because like
Katie, you go. Yeah. It's just, I mean, personally, I've just been trying to be more specific with things, and instead of saying that person's Asian, be like, oh, that person is Korean, or, you know, whatever. I mean, that's just something that I've been doing personally. Yeah, I don't really, I understand people want to move away from Asian because it does kind of, what we were saying earlier, create this sort of, it turns Asian culture into sort of a monolith of one thing. But personally, I find a lot of my strength and my passion comes from being Asian and that identity. So yeah, I mean, I'm trying to be more specific, but at the same time, if someone calls me, Asian, that personally I think it's fine. I don't get offended by it or anything, but I think, knowing that not everyone feels that way is important as well.
I think like with stuff like that, it does come with time as well. Cause like, if you can be specific, because that's what I am as well. I will say I'm Chinese. I think cause like Asian is always like imposed on us. I know with myself as well, is that if I am speaking for a community and it is the East Asian community, I will say that because that does acknowledge our privilege there as well. Does anyone else have anything that they like to add on that?
Yeah, I think you're right, Jax. It's sort of like whether it's Southeast Asian or like East Asian. There's so many different categories. It could be like India and other Southeast Asian countries. So it's very specific. It depends what context that you're talking about. If you're whether like making work about a specific area, or if you're talking with a specific group. So yeah, I mean, sometimes generalizing Asia or Asian can be quite offensive sometimes, but like as you're saying, like talking in a group of Southeast Asians, like it's better to be specific to share like what part you're from.
Definitely. Okay, someone said, hi Jex, you mentioned our responsibility in speaking on these topics to our family and friends who are not based in the West. How do you think we can have these conversations productively? There's often such a massive gap in understanding. My advice with this is to be patient and just, because like, yeah, I think from my own experiences with my family, it's taken me like 8 years to break through to my mum. 2 of those years, I actually like refused to physically see her until she understood that she needed to like change her mindset about these things. I did threaten to withhold grandchildren as well, because like that kind of works within Asian families. But yeah, it's just like, I guess with these conversations, I think for me, I thought about it from my personal experience of unlearning racism myself and like what kind of went through my head, and then how I can like tailor that from the other side of that perspective. So it's a tricky question. But I think it's just like there are ways that you can go into it. It's just like a slow introduction, like, to like pile it all onto someone is a bit intense, and it's intense for anyone to experience with any topic really. So if you and racism, it is hard to talk about. So I think it's just to ease into this. I remember like with my mom, I was like easing her into it. She wasn't like really accepting. So then you kind of just have to find what works. There's no real one solution or one way to do that. Whatever works for you, whatever works with your family. Like I was already quite estranged with my family to begin with. So talking to them is just hard. So I had to find what I needed to work for me. Does anyone else have any experiences that they like to share, speaking to their family and having these conversations?
I found that books actually really helped. For me, I've taken it quite slow, but slowly and surely at least we're discussing it. And I think starting is already like a good thing. And as long as you're continuing those, whether it's through like books or suggesting like movies or things that can help educate them, that to me has really helped. Yeah, I think those are like starter points that I find quite useful, stuff that they can explore on their own, and then you can open up the discussion. Because it is a lot to take in, like all in one go, if you haven't had that conversation before. So books are a great way to break in, suggesting certain books.
I think persistence is a good one as well.
Yeah.
I think persistence, because like my parents are very stubborn and they don't like reading. they don't have the time or patience to sit down and read, or like maybe they'll like watch some trash TV. But I have a younger sister and she's 12 years younger than me, and she's very, you know, supportive of the Black Lives Matter, and she's at home trying to have these conversations with my family and sort of calling my parents out whenever there's, you know, something that's not right or they shouldn't say that. And she's very strong about it, but then there's sort of denial of, no, it's fine. But they come from a different generation. But I think calling them out and being persistent with it until they really understand it, I think maybe that's something like that's what like most Asian families probably are doing.
And I think like with like this massive gap in understanding as well, what I found to help me recently is to actually research the lives that my parents went through in China and like where that discrimination might come from, what the root from it is. Because like obviously me growing up in the West is very different to my mum growing up in communist China. So to like decrease the gap myself, I learned what my life, like what life was like for my mum, which did help like breaking through to her. But I am just looking at the time now. So yeah, I think the time is up. Thank you to everyone that's been watching, and thank you to all the panelists for, you know, sharing their wisdom with all of us. And yeah, all right, I think it's.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.